All right. Well, I am going to just make a couple quick opening remarks before I hand things over to Sabrina. It is my pleasure to invite you or to welcome you, sorry, to our first Game Lab event. And I am here to give credit where credit is due. This is really Sabrina Zacharias's brainchild. And I'm so proud of her. If I can say that, I feel like I am being, I don't know, too parental or something, but I just am so impressed with the innovation and the vision that she brought to this. Really, the game studies lab started with a conversation between myself and Sabrina. I am her supervisor, and she came to me one day and said, "Oh, I wish I could do this neo-Victorian stuff on games, just video games." And I said to her, "Why not? Do it. I've seen these games. They're brilliant. There's so much there to talk about. Why not be the first person?" And so she really is part of this new wave of scholars that you see here together, gathered, that are thinking about video games and literature and bringing video games to my field, Victorian studies. And I'm really excited and proud of the work that she's doing. So I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to her so that she can tell you about Game Lab. Oh.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Brooke. I am so excited to welcome you all to our very first installment of Let's Play Game Talk, part of Queen's Game Lab, as we're putting together an interdisciplinary lab here that Brooke has wonderfully started to sort of help us exchange ideas and encourage research around video games. So I'm so pleased to have been able to put this together and had the support from Brooke and also Sarah Smith, who was definitely my sounding board for a lot of this. So I'm very pleased to be one of the moderators here today. So I will kind of just get right into it. I'm going to introduce our very first speaker that we have, so we can get right into our game studies. So our very first speaker today is Dr. Chloe Stewart. She is a postdoctoral research fellow in psychology at Queen's. She is particularly interested in social cognition and emotions and would love for you to take part in her studies. She also has one beautiful wife and two beautiful cats. So please welcome Chloe.
Hi, thank you, everybody. I just want to say this is my first time in a long time giving a presentation that doesn't involve any kind of math or like a graph. So please bear with me. I'm doing my best. So today I'm going to be talking to you about a game which is called Loved. And I'm going to be talking about what it tells us about the relationship between the player and the game. So to start with, Loved is a Flash-based platform game which was created by Australian artist and graphic designer Alexander Ocias and released in 2010. To play the game from beginning to end, it takes about 5 to 10 minutes, which depends on the player's knowledge of the game and skill, as well as the choices that are made in the game. So throughout this game, you are a creature and you are navigating a hostile terrain. And you are accompanied and instructed by a narrator who loves you right up until the moment it no longer does. So throughout the game, the path that you can take never changes. The obstacles are always where they're always found. The narrator provides instructions, and some of these instructions are helpful. So for example, here it tells you to touch the statue. This is the save point, and statues recur throughout the game where you can save. So if you die, you won't be sent all the way back to the start of the game. Some of the instructions it gives you are apparently neutral. It tells you not to move at this point. There's no reason why you can or can't move. It doesn't affect you to stay in that place. And then finally, some of them are actively harmful to you. So for example, it tells you here to travel the lower path. If you go above the path, it's completely easy. There's no hazards. If you follow the lower path, it's a lot harder to navigate. As a player in this game, you choose whether you want to obey the narrator or not. If you choose to obey the narrator, the game becomes completely black and white, but it also becomes more detailed and less angular. So you can see here plants and obstacles, statuary appear where previously there were nondescript bricks. And occasionally the narrator will praise you. If you choose to disobey the narrator, colorful blocks will instead appear. They appear erratically and quickly overwhelm the rest of the background. Hazards appear as red blocks, and it's impossible to tell what kind of hazard they are just from looking at them. And the path becomes a little bit less traversable. And throughout this time, the narrator will also insult you. So I'm going to be talking about Loved and its narrator and how the narrator conveys to us that in video games, free will is an illusion. So does the game own your body or your mind? It owns both. I'm particularly interested in Loved because of how it presents the relationship between the player and the game at its most sort of basic. So in all video games, there is some pressure by the video game to constrain your behavior and direct it towards the goal that the game finds most worthwhile. So how it does this, it varies a lot by the game that you're playing. For example, in Stardew Valley, you may be familiar with. The game gives you tasks for you to complete. These are often constrained by time within the game. So it directs you to complete these jobs within that set of time, telling you how to behave. It can also goad you with pleasant outcomes like leveling up or gaining new items, as in Persona 5. It can also give you approval from characters who you formed a relationship with, like here in Baldur's Gate 3. And it can also goad you with punishments from characters who you form relationships with. So in all these ways, the game sort of control your behavior. So it's really easy not to think about the way that the game is controlling your behavior, the way that the structures of the game reflect the will of the game. So they're never really framed that way, and it's not a typical way to think about the tasks that you're being set, the characters that you're encountering, because they're part of the narrative and the mechanic of the game and a function of the characters, your relationship to them. So when you complete a task or make a friend or level up, it feels like you're choosing to do that, but are you? So in Loved, the presence of the narrator stops us and asks us to stop thinking about, stop going forward with our tasks without thinking about them, making unthinking choices. So instead, we're sort of joining this communication with the narrator and thus with the game. So if I were to show you this slide without showing you what you're supposed to do on it, what the narrator tells you to do, you'd probably naturally try to jump over the red squares because they just look like they're probably bad news. It's bad vibes there. But what if the narrator told you to jump over that pit of barbs? If you do it, the narrator will tell you that you're good and it will reveal the hazard to you. There are barbs under there. If you fail, the narrator will be disappointed in you and it will punish you with visual noise. So I want you to think about who now is in control of your choice to jump over that pit of barbs. Later in the game, you arrive at another pit of barbs right there at the very bottom of that column. This comes after a really difficult to navigate area. If you fall into this pit of barbs, you will have to re-navigate that difficult stretch of track. There's no way to avoid it. It's really irritating to get through, take my word on that. And what would you sort of naturally do when you come to this point? And what would you do if the narrator told you to do it? So the narrator in this game is sort of the game itself made manifest. So it makes visible the otherwise invisible story pressures that direct us throughout a game. So it asks us to consider who's in charge of our behavior in a video game. So throughout the game, the narrator offers us the illusion of choice. This begins right from the first moment of the game where the narrator asks us to choose a gender for ourselves. So regardless of the gender chosen, it was made in 2010, so we just have to accept this, I'm sorry. Regardless of the gender chosen, the narrator refutes you and addresses you as the other gender for the whole game. So if you choose man, it says, no, you are a girl. I don't have the time to get into that and focus on that, but that's a lot to unpack. We'll move on. The next choice it offers you is, will I teach you how to play or not? So in a traditional game, this would be the point at which new players could join a tutorial and old players could skip it and get into actually playing the game. But in Loved, if you ask to be taught how to play, the narrator responds, you do not deserve it. And if you say, I don't want to learn, it says, you will fail. So immediately, sort of the antagonism of the narrator of this game becomes apparent, whether you choose to approach it with compliance or with defiance. Either way, your choice does not matter. By presenting us with these options while never actually offering us a choice, the narrator shows us how our choices in this game and in all games are fundamentally meaningless and fundamentally not our own. So they exist within the framework of behavior that the game expects and permits. So whether we want to learn to play or not, the game will continue. The need to make a choice in any game, including Loved, exists obviously independent of the existence of a narrator. In the absence of a narrator, it's very likely that you as a player would make a lot of the same decisions that the narrator directs you to make in Loved. Typically, video games are framed as subject to the will of the player. So after all, you as a player make choices, and those choices are what carries forward the narrative of the game. In open world games like The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the player is able to undertake objectives and approach tasks or story beats at their own pace. And this differentiates it from games with more traditional sort of linear stories, which have set paths that you follow at set times. However, most of the times when people play video games, even open world games, they default to unthinking compliance to the game. So they follow the objectives, complete the tasks, help the designated good people, and kill the designated bad people. This is, in video games, after all, the only way to advance the narrative or to progress your character. So if you do not obey the silent will of the game, you do not play the game. You may think it's totally not true. When I play video games, I'm always breaking the rules. I love to avoid the tasks. I'm always doing what I'm not supposed to. But there is nothing that you can do that isn't in some way anticipated by the game, because if you can do it, the game permits it. An example I can give is the game Skyrim. So I used to watch my roommate in undergrad play Skyrim, and I would constantly try to convince her to shiv the Jarls, who are story necessary non-player characters. And she would always tell me that she couldn't because it was against the rules and it would get her character in trouble. And that is true, but also the Jarls are unkillable because they're pillars of the game. So it's not possible to kill them because the game does not want you to kill them, no matter how much your roommate really wants you to. So in Loved, your choices are pretty simple. You choose to obey the narrator or you choose to disobey the narrator. But once again, this is the illusion of choice. The game expects and allows both choices. Regardless of whether you choose to be a good girl or an ugly creature, the path of the game remains identical. I spoke a little bit before about the physical changes that the game undergoes based on your choices in the game. When you obey the narrator, of course, the game becomes visually better and the narrator praises you. So it's just a little bit easier to navigate when it looks like this. And it's also physically easier to navigate because it's more angled. It's not so sharp. But if you disobey, of course, the game becomes visually chaotic, almost appearing to be physically breaking down. The narrator berates you throughout. When the game begins to visually break down, it is like breaking, but it's not broken, because even though you're actively defying the game and working against its rules, you've not actually broken the game system or escaped from the game itself. Because in Loved, you can be good or bad, obedient or rebellious, but you are still playing. This is best highlighted in the final two commands that the narrator gives you. First, it tells you do not fail, and then it tells you do not fail. So if you're obedient, you simply continue to play the game to the best of your ability. And if you're rebellious, you can throw yourself into the barbs or let these stars catch you. They'll come after you and burst you if they can. But eventually, you have to either successfully complete the game, failing to fail, or you cease to play the game. It is not possible to rebel so much that the game cannot still love you. So this is highlighted by the conclusion of the game. If you're sufficiently obedient, the game says, I am so happy that you are mine. I loved you always. If you rebelled, the game asks, why do you hate me? I loved you. Either way, the narrator, the game, loves you. You might say there is no chance that this game loves me. It has been nothing but antagonistic and controlling to me. This is definitely true. The narrator, who is the game, is cruel and demeaning to you. It misgenders you. It asks you to do things that hurt you, and it berates and punishes you if you don't. The narrator of Love is antagonistic towards you because all games are antagonistic to their players. Although, again, this is not how we typically frame it when we think about the relationship between a player and a game. The whole purpose of playing a game is to defeat obstacles that the game brings to you. This may mean like winning a fight, collecting an item, earning gold, catching a really annoying fish, just so a fake old man will be nice to you. These are artificial barriers placed in your way by the will of the game. A game wants you to succeed, but succeeding means defeating the game and leaving the game behind. There's a really strange tension between you and the game, and this tension is evident throughout your interactions with the narrator of Loved. It hates you, but it loves you. It offers you choices, but permits no choice. When you finish the game, the narrator asks you to start again. The narrator needs you to remain trapped within the false choices of the game, because without you, the game does not exist. The narrator wants you to win, but it does not want you to leave. When you follow the directions of the narrator in Loved, you are making the game visibly better, but when you don't, you are visibly breaking it. This interaction between the game state and your behavior implies that games are not just a product that is made by itself, which exists independent of us, but a product that requires a player to be complete. A game without a player is not a game. To fully break the game, you would need to turn it off. And if you turned it off, the game wouldn't exist. The game needs you. You are loved. Thank you.
So much, Chloe. That was so interesting and fascinating. Okay. I am here to introduce our second speaker of the day, who is Wild Ferris. So Wild Ferris is a queer, trans, non-binary dyke and PhD candidate at Queen's University. Wild's research explores queerness and religious repression in Victorian ghost stories, however, also often explores queerness and trans identity in other new medias, including films, comics, and video games. When they are not reading, they can be found playing Stardew Valley beside their large orange cat. I can vouch for that personally. Wild, everybody.
There we go. All right. So I'm here to talk to you today about 11-bit Studios Frostpunk. So to start off, so that didn't quite work as much as I would like, but that's okay. What happens there is at the opening of 11-bit Studios Frostpunk, you are met with the haunting sound of a howling wind, which leads into the reverberating boom of a bass drum. Following this is only silence. The opening screen beckoning you to press any key to continue, showing a large mass of people hidden behind the logo, and faded into the background between you and them is a steady stream of smoke. In this silence, you are separated from this crowd in front of you. You are barred from accessing them by this snow. You are alone. So, Frostpunk is a city builder, survival horror, and resource management game, which places the player in control of a small group of survivors who have left 19th century London following the volcanic apocalyptic winter in a crater which is warmed by a central massive generator. As a top-down game, meaning that the view of the player is overhead, looking down on the scene in front of them, the player is able to view all of the civilization they are in charge of, growing and protecting. You can see here that kind of outline of that crater with the central large pillar of the generator in the middle. Over the course of the game, the player must make decisions in order to protect their growing refuge. This means that the player may need to make unsavory decisions, like turning down the generator in order to burn less coal, and thus freezing some of the survivors around it, or in an attempt to increase resource gathering, creating laws that will allow for child labor, disposal of disabled citizens, or even allowing so disposal of disabled citizens, or even allowing for the consumption of the dead. In response to the player's actions, the citizens may begin to tire of some of the player's rules. The fear of their predicament leading to them stealing resources and preserves, or fighting against the player's newly announced laws, forcing the player into more questionably moral decisions. Does the player engage in religious whippings and torture to force compliance? Do they sentence thieves to solitude and thus certain death outside of the settlement? Throughout the game, the player is faced with these ethical and moral questions on what is the right thing to do in such a survival situation. Do they turn away the sick and injured? Do they force children to work to help gather resources? Do they let the grievously injured perish instead of giving them food? These are all questions the player must contend with throughout their gameplay, or risk their own expulsion from the settlement, and thus a game over. By placing the player in charge of the entire city, Frostpunk continues to isolate the player from the settlement they are in charge of. The player must choose what needs to be done in order to survive, regardless of morality. Because of this, the player doesn't act as part of the settlement, but rather as an omnipotent viewer who shapes the potential of the refugees' futures. So, leaving behind video games for a second, going to be doing a little bit of early 19th century study. I want to introduce you to the Panopticon. So this is first invented in the late 1780s, going into the early 19th century. Jeremy Bentham joined his brother Samuel in Russia, where he began to draft the idea of a new form of surveillance building, the Panopticon. The building's design was meant to create space for prisoners, workers, students, and the poor to exist within a space of total constant surveillance. Instead of allowing inmates moments of privacy, the cells of the Panopticon are constantly under watch because of the construction of the building itself. The building's design is circular, about 100 meters across, which leaves room for 48 cells on one level, assuming that each cell is about 6 feet wide at the outermost wall. And then in the center of the building is a tall singular column where the manager is able to view every cell in the building at any time. If the building then contains multiple levels, this means that hundreds of inmates could be watched by a single guard, thus lowering the cost of security while also increasing the appearance of surveillance. And our good old friend Michel Foucault, in his book, Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison, Michel Foucault describes the Panopticon not as a building, but as a machine for dissociating the see/being seen dyad. In the peripheric ring, one is totally seen without ever seeing. In the central tower, one sees everything without ever being seen. Unlike in normal human interactions, where both parties exist as seen and being seen, the panoptic machine creates an innate hierarchy using surveillance to cement these two different classes. The seen, the inmates, are starved of their privacy. Even though each inmate may not be seen directly all the time, due to the backlighting of the central tower, an inmate is unable to know whether they are or are not being seen at any moment, and thus feeling like they are under constant surveillance. For the person in the tower, the manager, they are starved from human connection, any human connection possible through this mutual seeing. While they watch continually, their personhood is removed in the eyes of those who watch. The manager is not human, but instead a tool used for control. Through this disconnected duality of inmate and manager, neither fully humanized in the opposite's eyes, the machine effect mentioned by Foucault is achieved. He says, the Panopticon is a marvelous machine which, whatever use one may wish to put it to, produces homogeneous effects of power. The use of this machine is clearly explained in Jeremy Bentham's own letters as he was pitching this idea, and he explains that the Panopticon is meant to help encourage manufacturing with its inmates. Unlike standard prison punishment in the late 18th century, Bentham's panoptic prison would not rely on the literal starvation of its prisoners or brutal physical beatings or hard labor, and other torturous activities. Instead, Bentham employed only one form of punishment, boredom. He wrote, "If a man won't work, nothing has he to do, from morning to night, but to eat his bad bread and drink his water without a soul to speak to. If he will work, his time is occupied and he has his meat and his beer, or whatever else his earnings may afford him. And not a stroke does he strike, but he gets something which he would not have got otherwise. This encouragement is necessary to his doing his utmost. But more than this is not necessary. It is necessary every exertion he makes should be sure of its reward. But it is not necessary that such reward be so great, or anything near so great as he might have had he worked elsewhere. The confinement which is his punishment, preventing his carrying the work to another market, subjects him to a monopoly, which the contractor, his master, like any other monopolist, makes of course as much of as he can." So using this basic reward system, which rewards inmates for the work by providing them with better food and access to beer instead of water, as well as providing the inmates with a purpose and a thing to do, the machine is able to encourage the output of goods. While inmates can choose to not engage in the production, they are also not permitted to do much else. Under the omnipotent eye of the manager, the inmates cannot communicate to their neighbors, nor view the inmate across from them. Instead, the inmates can choose either between work or simply sitting and waiting for their time imprisoned to be done. This boredom paired with the isolation would cause time to drag and thus making their sentence more painful. However, with more production and a task to complete, the inmates reward with better food and the time of their confinement passing quicker. Through this simple action leading to reward system, the panoptic machine would be able to increase the production of whatever they task their inmates with. If the panoptic building is a school, a result would be more studious students. If it is a prison, the product is cheap labor. If it's a hospital, it is less able to pass on disease while enforcing more bed rest from their inmates. This machine of production is fueled by that central tower, acting as a pervasive and oppressive force on the workers, ensuring continued production and halting any attempts to connect with their cell neighbors and thus other humans. In this panoptic machine, the worker is dehumanized, stripped of any social connection to human society. Instead, they simply become a tool of production and thus something to capitalize on. The central tower and the manager within acts as the engine, ensuring the rest of the machine is running without interruption, with continual production and without humanity. So, returning to video games after that little 19th century vacation, Frostpunk uses this idea to help further the isolation of the player. The game is designed around the idea of isolation. The sound design, ideally I would be playing a little bit of the music here, but because of some of the tech stuff, I'm just not going to. But because of the sound design, from launching the game program to the hectic anxiety of trying to survive a negative 80 degrees Celsius winter storm, is always haunted by the sound of blowing wind and falling snow. Violins are used in a soft minor tones to express sadness in the new environment around the player. Paired with the environmental sounds, these sad tones create a depressing and solemn atmosphere that is only broken by the sound of a human voice, calling out when work shifts start, stop, and a new law is introduced. Otherwise, there is no verbal communication, only the sound of the wind and the constant reminder of the peril the settlement is in. In the opening credits, the player is shown their refugees leaving London, isolating themselves from the rest of the surviving world. While this story is shown through art depicted at the eye level of the human, which you can see here in that picture, these two pictures, the game opens onto the playing field eventually, and the player's view is removed from the connected humanity of the previous art, and is instead placed as an overhead spectator, entirely removed from the rest of the 80 survivors that you are controlling. The player can see everything around the town, from the circumference of the crater and its scattered resource piles to the central column of the generator. The other survivors, however, are depicted as small NPCs, non-player characters. These small dots of humanity are only distinguished if clicked on, where they are given a randomized and vaguely British-sounding name. Once selected, however, these details are easily lost and forgotten amongst the rest of the crowd, who are largely indistinguishable from one another. The amalgamous population of NPCs quickly begin to lose their feeling of humanness and simply exist within the confines of the world the player controls. The player assigns a certain amount of NPCs to do one task, and those NPCs go and perform the task. There is no communication or conversation. There's only action and production. This disconnection from the rest of the refugees that the player is in control of mimics that panoptic machine. The player is able to see all that the NPCs do, ensuring that they are performing their labor to a satisfactory amount, while being able to interact in a humanistic way with while being unable to interact in a humanistic way with each refugee. Similarly, the NPCs are not able to interact with the player. They simply follow the orders that the player sets without any argument. The only time that this separation is broken is when the player is faced with a choice. If the town complains about an issue, the player is met with a black text box and a couple of different action options that they must choose from. The only visible change upon a decision is in the level of the town's hope and discontent, which is demonstrated. You can see there by the two bars at the bottom of the screen that the red one shows a rise of discontent in the NPCs. The blue shows a rise of hope in them. You need to make sure that you manage those levels, otherwise you will be evicted. The presentation of the panoptic machine continues in the design of the game field itself. While the game later introduces more maps for the player to use, the original map is set in a circular crater. The center of the crater is where the generator is set, which must always be on and warming the settlement if the player wishes to not lose the game. The generator itself, depicted as a tall, thin tower, around the base of the generator sit all the homes of the NPCs. This structure directly references the building plans of the panopticon. While the player does not view the NPCs from the central point of the generator, by giving the player an unbroken view of the entire crater and replicating the simple construction of the panopticon itself, there's a clear connection between the map and the panoptic machine. This homage to the panoptic machine opens a new exploration of the role of humans within the panopticon. While the dehumanization of the inmates in the panopticon is obvious, through the removal of their ability to socialize with others and stripping of their privacy, the humanity of the manager is also removed. The manager is never seen, only heard from when they are ensuring proper conformity from the inmates, and is given an illusion of omnipotent perception. To the inmates of the panopticon, the tower itself becomes the image of the manager. The physical human body of the manager is stripped away, and instead becomes linked to the dark and ever-present shape of the tower. If the tower can be seen, then the prisoner is being seen. As Foucault states, the inmate will continually have before his eyes the tall outline of the central tower from which he is spied upon. The inmate must never know whether he is being looked at any one moment, but he must be sure that he always may be so. This illusion of constant viewing degrades the human experience of mutual viewing and thus degrades the perception of the manager as a human at all. The manager becomes all-powerful, otherworldly, and intangible. They are not human, they simply become a symbol of control. Within the framework of Frostpunk, the player becomes this inhuman manager. They control the working production of the NPCs below them, aiming to find the most economical way to increase resource creation. There's even an option in the game to reduce NPCs' rations if the NPC is unable to perform their assigned post, while giving double rations to workers who work a 24-hour shift. This directly mimics the reward system created by Bentham to ensure high production rate. By doing this, the player controls all aspects of the NPC's life and watches them at all times. The player can focus on one specific NPC or can view the entire settlement as a whole. There is no avatar to represent the player amongst the NPCs. The player is not counted as a member of the population in the settlement either. The player acts alone, bodiless, and all-knowing. This avatarless state is changed only in one specific scenario in the game, the player's failure. If the control of the settlement goes awry, the settlement has the ability to vote the player out of their seat of power. If the hope of the NPCs falls too low, discontent of the NPCs raises too high, the player loses the game. In this instance, the game shows the player's avatar for the first and only time. The player is depicted as a single man walking away from the crater alone. It is only in the banishment of the human in this banishment that the human body of the player's avatar is shown. It is only in the direct isolation of the player from the society they were building that the player is shown to have even been human at all, like the rest of the NPCs. This reassures the idea of the isolation of the player. While the player was unable to be part of the settlement while acting as the manager of the panoptic machine, the player is also isolated once they are returned to their human image, as they are no longer accepted into the world of constant production. The player failed to continue to produce the necessary production of the panopticon, which is as it is designed to create, and thus is forced out of the panoptic society as a whole. Frostpunk uses the isolation of the player as a way to further demonstrate the horror of the world that it's set in. Faced with the apocalyptic winter that has led to the destruction of the 19th century society, the player and their settlement are forced to try and survive in an unforgiving and dangerous new world. While in the game, the player can explore outside of the settlement using scouts, and as the scouts continue to explore, they are met continuously with destroyed villages, piles of dead refugees from other settlements, cannibalism, and a continuously deteriorating snow-covered world. Outside of the settlement, civilization is hopeless. The attempt to try and create a new settlement is foolhardy. The game wants the player to know that they are alone and that they are doomed. By isolating the player from the settlement they control, all decisions and thus the survival of their settlement is entirely placed on the player. What they choose affects the entire settlement. Frostpunk wants the player to know that there is no escape. The settlement may survive one more winter storm, but as the game progresses, the temperature continues to drop, and there's no sign that it'll ever stop. The player begins to feel less human themselves. Maybe they're forced to use child labor in their settlement in order to gain more workers, or they have to turn away new groups of survivors who are too injured to work, and thus are simply a drain on the settlement's limited resources. The player begins to make choices outside of their human morality in order to continue to ensure the perpetual production of the panoptic machine. The role of the player as the panoptic manager dehumanizes the player not only in game, but in the act of playing the game. This position ensures that the player feels isolated within the game, as well as isolated outside of the game, through the abandonment of their human society. The game wants the player to know that they are alone, and in that isolation, they are afraid. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Wild. That was wonderful. Alright. I will introduce our last speaker for the day. We have Valentina Gallo. She is a PhD candidate in English at Queen's University. Their field of study is modern popular culture, and her thesis is on madness and weird fiction. Valentina got her MA in English Studies at the University of Venice and her MFA in creative writing at the University of St. Andrews. We will just get the slide set up here now, but please help me welcome Valentina.
All right, perfect. So here I am, thank you all. And today I'm here to talk to you about the game Tyranny, which is perfect. Okay, which is a role-playing game developed by Obsidian Entertainment and published by Paradox Interactive on November 10, 2016. So this game is set in the world of Tyranny, which is for 90% under the control of Kyros the Overlord. I think it's Kyros, might be Kairos. It's fine. The in-universe calendar begins at 432, with year 0 being the first big victory of Kyros' world conquest. With that said, Kyros has been plotting for more than 500 years. That is a little bit more than the normal average human lifespan. That is probably important. Who knows? So, this right here are the Archons. So, the Archons are people with extraordinary powers. And these ones specifically, they are, let's say, Kyros generals. Not all of them are fighters, but they do all her biddings. The Archons are a great representation of the power of belief in this universe. Let's look, for example, at Siren, which hopefully on Zoom you see me pointing to it. Siren is the Archon of music. She has mind control powers. And one of the moments she is most proud of is that she almost convinced Kyros to kill herself. Then at the last moment, she got too nervous. So the way Siren got her powers was by being a good singer. She was such a good singer that eventually people started thinking that she could control people with her voice. That belief made her capable of controlling others, which made people believe in her powers even more. All of the Archons have this sort of story. Their powers come from these beliefs, let's say. People believe in them, which makes them capable of doing something, which makes people believe in them, which makes them more powerful. Now, one of these Archons is Tunan, the Archon of Justice, and that is your direct boss. Players take the role of the Fatebinder. Here, there's various representations of various possible Fatebinders. A Fatebinder is a sort of judge-bred figure. I hope any of you knows this. If you don't get this reference, it's somebody who is a judge, jury, and executioner. The Fatebinders are agents of Kyros' law, and therefore Kyros' will. The Fatebinder is in, The Fatebinder is in the tiers. The tiers is the last remaining place on the Tyranny that is not under Kyros' control. You are there as a conqueror. During the game, you choose whether to follow your mission or not. But the unskippable prologue sees you decide whether to steal food from the villagers or the merchants, taking over a city by burning or like tricking them and letting your soldiers in and have them slaughter them, stuff like that. Now, you may look at this and you go, are we the baddies? We are. We are the baddies. I will unpack that in a future, in future writing. But for now, let's just accept our villainy, take a deep breath, and move on. So, let's move on to Kyros. Who is Kyros? Kyros is the Overlord. Kyros has been around for more than 500 years. That's all we know about Kyros. Do we know if Kyros is a man or a woman? No. One time we asked Siren, who has seen Kyros in person, and Siren goes, oh, you don't know? I assume the Fatebinder would have been given an audience with him. It doesn't seem like she would let you perform actions in his name without speaking to you. It's not going to matter once you defeat him anyway. She'll be gone. So you never find out their gender. If they have one, you never see them. It's never shown. In fact, Kyros is doing a lot to keep her history as anything but Overlord secret. here, another fate binder is telling you a story that happened back in the day where she was talking, they went to see this guy who had decided to create a spire in no, not a spire, to create a shrine at a spire, which is, doesn't matter, it's a video game thing, to create a shrine to Kiras in a spire in the far southeast. So they go there, the fate binder and other ones, and they see that this person is just innocently saying, I love Kiras, I'm here for Kiras, I love Kiras. And that's already against the law. You cannot do that. Like Kiras is an overlord, and you like that's it. And you don't talk about what happened before Kiras became, an overlord. But this person did, and they said, "Oh, Kiras was here back in -50," and that makes the other fate binder kill him. And the one that was telling you this is like, I have long wondered why such a comment should require death instead of the traditional removal of the tongue. So, Kiras really doesn't want anybody to know anything about Kiras, which takes us to part of Kiras' law. One of the big laws that we do know is that the overlord's name is not yours to use. What does this mean? Well, here's some of the examples given in the video game. The overlord name, is there some? Okay, no. The overlord name is not yours to give, whether to progeny, product, location, or abstraction. Slander of the overlord is punishable by death. So, nobody can have the same name as Kiras. Kiras is Kiras' name. You cannot say that Kiras is bad. You cannot say that Kiras did something. You can only say what Kiras wants to say. Then, there is only one Kiras. No one may say Kiras and have it obfuscated by a second meaning. Neither will her name be associated to trivialities. A gambler will not attribute his fortune to Kiras' luck, or his misfortune to Kiras' scorn. Such an association lowers the overlord in the public estimate and is rightly considered slander most foul. Any vow or expression made using Kiras' name is a binding legal contract. Breaking such a vow is punishable by death. One of the examples shown in the game about the last one is, let's say that somebody says, by Kairos, you're stupid. Then somebody who hates you can get some people to go there and say, well, that person is not stupid. Therefore, you are lying, and you get the death penalty, and you die. So you cannot use Kairos' name in vain, essentially. And, why? What does that mean? So, what is Kairos? What is Kairos? Let's look at what is Kairos for us. Well, no, actually, let's look at what you can use Kairos' name for. Kiras, here. I'll use both names, whatever. Kiras, so you can use Kiras for two things, to say three things. Kiras, the overlord, Kiras' empire, and Kiras' law. Therefore, the implication here is that Kiras is the law of the land, it is the land, and it is the overlord, making all of these things the same thing. So what is Kiras? That's Kiras, or that will be Kiras once the last part, Alteratus, is taken over. Now, the idea of belief, as shown here, is of course extremely powerful in the game, but in some ways the real world does work that way too. That's essentially a social construct. Are countries real? I mean, the only reason why Canada, for example, exists is because we all politely agree that Canada exists, With that said, if a group of American soldiers decided to camp in Sarnia, that would be that would have horrible and terrible consequences for everybody, everywhere, you know? So we have this idea of belief, and something that is similar to this idea of what is Kyros? Kyros is the law, Kyros is the land. We see for royalty. So this guy here is Louis XIV of France, also known as the Sun King. He was known as the Sun King because of his belief in the absolute power of the monarchy. And in fact, he probably did not actually say that. He did not actually say l'état c'est moi. However, he may as well have said it because that's how he acted. And the way is, and what this means is, I am the state. So the king is the state. What happens to the, doesn't matter what he says goes. And most importantly, he continues to exist, even if the country, no, let's move on. I'll be clearer here. Oh, wrong computer, so sorry. Okay. So here, this one other picture is Louis XIV great grandchild, Louis XVI. Yeah, Louis XVI, the last French king before the French Revolution. So you may know that he does not survive the French Revolution. And the issue of his persona as the king, l'état c'est moi, was incredibly important. That was fundamental to the Revolutionary Tribunal. Nobody wanted to kill Louis Capet, the man. It was fine, it was okay. But there was Louis XVI, the king. And Louis XVI, the king, is the ancien regime. Louis XVI, the king, is the monarchy. And if he is alive, then the ancien regime is alive. And therefore, we must kill him. So what we have here is that, what I'm trying to say is that the royals are symbols of the country and what they represent the country. Like, look at her, look at her. Don't you miss her? Wasn't she sweet? Look at her silly little hats. Look at her sweet smile. Wasn't she lovely? Would you ever abandon her? Would you ever leave the English monarchy? Would you never, ever leave? And so what we have here is that we know that the monarchs are representation of the country. But at the same time, if l'état c'est moi, in a certain way, that does mean also that if I am the state, it's not just, I am not just the face of the state. I am the state. And therefore, if I become a symbol, I cease to become just a human, and I become the country, which we see in Kyros. Like the royal family, we see that, and it's like, this is human. The monarchy has become a human thing that we love. But tyranny shows us the reverse. If you become the symbol of a country, you cease to be a human and become cold idea. So, all right, let's move to a sort of close. I've been focusing here on royalty, but of course, this is not an idea that only works for monarchy. Dictatorship have even a stronger power, In another game called Planescape Torment, which is a masterpiece and you should all play, the power of belief is even stronger. At one point, you can convince, at one point, the character has a flashback to a previous version of himself that convinced someone that they did not exist. And by convincing them that they did not exist, a person ceased to exist. Now, this, we kind of see that, like in a tyranny, in a dictatorship, this sort of power can happen. That man, it did not exist anymore after Stalin decided it did not exist. And and there's this power also exists in a democracy. If anything, you know, wouldn't we say that they are elected because, like, Trudeau has been elected by the people, therefore the people believe him. His political powers come from the will of the people. And if Trudeau does a blackface, all of Canada does a blackface, you know? And of course, Trudeau would never say, l'état c'est moi, Trump may, but at the same time, the point remains, he is in a certain way the state. Now, one question is this. In Tyranny, you're not able to defeat Kira's. Spoilers, sorry. Or you can choose the kind of person that you are. Will you be a minion or will you be a rebel? Will you be cruel or will you be kind? And the first time that I played Tyranny, I never rebelled. I always followed Kira's law and I always followed Kira's goals. But I was kind. I tried my best to be nice to everyone. I tried my best to make my followers happy. And many of my followers were people from the land that I was conquering. So it was like, I want to do what's best for you, even though I'm taking over your country, you know? I tried, I was the kindest stormtrooper that everyone ever met. And to be fair, that's not nothing. So, you know, we all have a choice and we all can be something and we can choose what we are seen at. So what are you and what do you want to be? Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much to all three of our panelists. All of those talks were wonderful. Sarah and I, as co-moderators of the panel, we want to open the floor to some questions and comments or thoughts anybody had. So what we're going to try to do, hopefully to allow folks on Zoom to hear, is bring around a microphone if you guys have a question, and then we just ask that you use the microphone to ask the question so that our Zoom folks have a better chance of hearing what's happening. So would anybody like to open the floor with a question? Jesse?
No, yes. I'm wondering if, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on that, or if really it's just, you know, changing who has the control? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I did think a little bit about those sorts of things, like having mods or doing other things like that, where people can like take what was originally planned by the creator of the game and then make something different for it. I think that it certainly like it creates a different level of the control that a game exerts over you as a game player, but I think it's still it is just kind of handing over the reins to someone else who's to be in control, because there is still like some level of control that somebody is exerting over the behavior in the game. I know that so I was trying to find, I was really trying to find any like images of people killing Jarls in Skyrim, and I think people have like been able to do it, but it does ruin the game, like it ruins your save. And so I think that that is kind of sort of emblematic of the way that like, sure, I guess you can eventually find a way to wiggle out of the constraints of the game, but at the same time, you're still not, because now you just broken the game and the game is no longer playable in the way that it once was. So yeah, I think it's a really interesting idea and something that I obviously didn't have a lot of time to go into, but definitely something to think about for the future. Yeah.
Yeah, that's
I was thinking a lot about what you said in terms of it's not just one. It's like, you know, but it's invisible sort of force that influence production. I immediately thought of the invisible hand, which was this concept by Brian Smith, who we really know was really sort of almost inspired by what she was influenced by. And the invisible hand is this sort of invisible force that free market economies restore the equilibrium. So it's specific production. So my question is, in the context of like you're saying, that kind of supervision where it's not mutual. Do you think there's something to be said about the production is just exhausting? You mentioned the design and how inevitably the player has to sacrifice children, able to be. Do you think there's something to be said about that?
I mean, if we want to get into it, I would argue that capitalism is innately a panopticon, because it is built on that idea of this need to continue to produce in order to gain capital, and in that is dehumanizing every person that's part of it, whether it be someone's at the bottom who's being exploited, or someone's at the top whose humanity and their morals are entirely removed at the end of it. So absolutely, I would say that that is part of it. I think just that kind of process of capitalism is innately exploitative, and that also requires there to be consistent surveillance, and living in a kind of a end of extreme capitalistic states that we live in right now. I think that kind of ideal of surveillance and being like unable to escape the panopticon is around us all of the time. All of our devices are listening to us, cameras are always watching us. We don't know who's watching those, but we know that we're being watched. So yes, absolutely.
I have a really simple question. I'll stand by the computer so you can hear it. I was really interested in this way that you were talking about the games as rules and the structure of the games. Is it really impossible to ever beat the game, that no matter what, the game has us basically trapped with its programs?
I would say that something similar. I remember a similar question coming from a game called Spec Ops: The Line, where it's. I'm going to spoil it by saying this. It's based on Heart of Darkness, and if you know Heart of Darkness, you already know how it ends. So the thing of the game is that it's one of those. It's based. You are a soldier. And it's one of those shooters game, and you're in war and you're killing a lot of brown people. I'm sorry, I don't want to, that's literally what, like, that's the genre in a nutshell. And so you are you're just being broken, the character is being broken down as more and more horrible things happen, and you do these horrible things to people. And eventually the question becomes, why are you playing? Why are you doing this? This is the choice to play is the choice to inflict this suffering. And the way to win is to stop playing. So kind of feels to me like the only way to win a game. I mean, you know, not every game relationship is that unfortunate, but the only way to really like win a game is to just forget about it and not play it anymore.
That's the real. Any other questions?
Can I just jump off of that 1 second very quickly?
Hold that up.
I'm so sorry. That also just reminds me of the game Undertale. So in Undertale, if for those that haven't played it, there are multiple different endings you can get depending on what route you go through the game, whether you decide to use violence or not. At the end of the game, if you play either the genocidal run where you kill everything you see, or you provide some harm while you're playing the game prompts you to restart the game. In order for it to then get the good ending. And then if you reach the good ending and you restart the game again, the game shuts itself down and it won't let you play it anymore. So there is that idea of the way you escape the game is by not playing the game. And sometimes the game decides for you, you're done, then no more, please.
Also a technique famously employed by Animal Crossing.
Thanks. I have a lot of comments that I'm trying to form into a question, but they might not come out that way, so apologize if that happens in advance. Thanks for some really engaging presentations. I really actually love the common theme that you had in them, of this idea of how authority is articulated in a narrative sense and how the player both engages with that and pushes back against that. And actually, I was going to bring up the Undertale example as well, because it reminded me of that and of Stanley Parable for the first two presentations. So I wanted to give comment a little bit about that role of the player engaging with authority, and I'm going to put that into a little bit of context. So I'm coming from music and media studies, and one of the scholars that I've encountered who's looked at that is by the name of Michel Chion, who looks at this concept called the acousmatic or acousmatic narrator, the idea of like an all-seeing entity within the game that is not necessarily the player, but which has control or the ability to comment on what's happening in the action. I guess that's a question for all three of you.
Can you possibly rephrase the question a little bit? I'm so sorry, I'm not sure how to answer.
Maybe comment on the pushback or the interplay between the authority role and the player role.
Okay, thank you. I think that one of the things that's really interesting about playing games like this, where you're kind of learning about, or you're interacting with the game, which is in the control role of you, is that you learn a little bit about yourself and like what kind of person you are. I learned I'm very compliant and I really love following rules. If it tells me what to do, it tells me to jump into that pit, and I jump into that pit. I don't question it. I go in the pit. And so I think that there are other people who would play, so not to only talk about Loved, but there are people who play Loved and immediately turn against the narrator because they know that they're being told what to do, and they're like, how dare you? You can't tell me what to do. I'll jump into this pit even though you told me to jump over it. Like, I'll do what I like. And I think that like the way that games interact with you as like the thing that's in control of you tells you a lot about yourself as the agent within the game. I don't know if that quite is like addressing what you're looking at, but that's my thought about like what it's like to interact with the games.
Yeah, I think thinking about it, the most, I don't think there's ever a time where the game is, I cannot find the correct word, so I'm going to potentially use an embarrassing choice of words, but submissive to you. Yes. Yeah, like,
That's a great choice of word, actually.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay, I forgot. Okay, so I don't think there's ever a time where like the game is not in control. Sometimes what happens is that the game lets you do what you want. Like Minecraft, the game doesn't tell you what to do. You can do whatever you want. But like, obviously you can do whatever you want in the Minecraft way. And so it's the most you can get is just here's the toys, play if you like, which is not necessarily the game being in control, but it's still not the game, and it's still not you defeating the game, so to speak.
Yeah, I think specifically thinking back to your example of the Stanley Parable, I think is one of the ones where it would be quite a good example of this kind of idea of a force acting against the player as like an all-knowing, because you have the narrator in the Stanley Parable who is narrating all of the player's actions, but then when the player does something that the narrator doesn't like, the narrator forcibly returns the player back to whatever spot they would like the player to be at and says, try again, but don't do that. So I feel like innately in the relationship between player and game, there's this assumption that the player is doing what they would like, in that same kind of idea where I think Chloe mentioned it in her presentation of, you know, you feel like you're breaking the rules by doing something, but the fact you're able to do it means that you're actually playing within the rule set. I think it kind of gives this illusion of the control of the player, but in actuality, the player is always under the control of the game. Like there is never that ability to escape that control. There's just the illusion of control given to the player.
Fun fact about the Stanley Parable. If anyone is familiar with the very popular TV series Severance, I just learned that it was partially inspired by the Stanley Parable. I think we have a question on the Zoom chat that we're going to turn to, and Sabrina would really, really like a turn with the microphone. So I'm going to pass it over to her to read that out. I just want to be a singer, okay? All right, so we have a comment and a question from Gwyn on our Zoom. She says, each speaker did a compelling job of recreating the experience of each game. The experience of humanity the games construct. In that respect, I want to commend the group's contribution to the humanities and ask the panel to articulate their perspective on how game studies uniquely contributes to knowledge and humanistic scholarship, using examples from their specific games if they like. It's great to see this work being done at Queen's.
I can start, while you guys consider and Chloe tries to re-engage her non-science brain. I think that studies in video games in general are innately tied to humanities because you're creating this kind of specifically like directed civilization that you are engaging with directly. And I come from an English background, English literature background, so like obviously I still think that this is very important in books as well, but there is a little bit more of an interaction that you can get within video games that you can't get in other styles of literature, that makes it so much more tangible in a way to be able to connect to these ideas of what is the humanist position in these little worlds that we're getting a glimpse of through the screen of our computer or Nintendo Switch, which is my preferred way. So I think in that sense that there's like any kind of game, and Frostpunk included, where you're quite literally just watching a civilization develop, brings into those questions of where does the human belong in these stories. And that is innately, obviously, like a positive thing when it comes to studies in the humanities.
All right, so I love video games, and I love the study of video games because of the way that you can interact with it. So I'll bring an example from my own thesis, which I don't remember if yes, no, I did. So my thesis is on weird fiction. And if you don't know what weird fiction is a lot of, oh my God, I saw an unspeakable horror and I cannot possibly describe it, but I'm going mad because it's so unspeakable and horrible. And that means one thing in a book. That means another thing in a video game where you probably are going to see it. Well, and that's one of the things. It's like, how do video games, which are a more visual kind of media, deal with trying to recreate something that you shouldn't be able to see? And the way that they usually do that is by giving you, I don't know, if you look at unspeakable horror, the screen gets weird, and it literally impacts you as a player. So there is the character in the game that is scared, and there is you the player who may not be scared, but are also going, oh my God, what is happening? Why is my screen glitching? Why is my screen freezing? And it's just a sort of interaction that doesn't really, you can't really get from a book. I mean, I've never been scared from a book. I'm gonna say it, you know? If something is scary in a book, just go to the next page. You know, it's fine. In a video game, I cannot play scary video games because I don't like being scared, and I don't like having a monster getting to me and killing me and being mean to me, you know. And of course, movies also fantastic and amazing, but you're still a passive, very well, passive recipient. In it, you are just receiving the you know what you are seeing. In a video game, you are scared. Yeah, you gotta get through those monsters, you know. Yeah, you're scared of the dark room. You gotta go through the dark room. You gotta, or you turn off the game. And I mean, yeah, so there's just a different kind of thing that forces you to, you know, makes you an actual agent in the and I mean, of course, we're all agents as readers, we get what we want, but in a video game, we're literally creating the thing.
Just really quickly, because I don't want to talk too much about the same things, but building on what Valentina was saying about like experiencing the game and being an agent in the game. This reminds me, there's a video game that I occasionally enjoy playing called Unreal Tournament 99. Shout out to that game. There's a couple of levels where you're essentially like running around. It's like a shooter kind of game, but you are like running around in this like environment where you can easily fall into like a pit. Or whatever. The game isn't telling you to fall into the pit, so you're not supposed to be doing that. You'll die. And I get so physically like worried about falling off of this non-existent cliff face. Constantly, I can't play those levels because they stress me out too much. And it's like, it's so interesting. I wouldn't feel that way if I was reading a book about somebody standing on a cliff face or even watching a movie about a cliff face. But playing that, now I'm that little guy. I don't want him to fall off the face of the cliff. So, and also, I was thinking while Wild and Valentina were talking about something that I kind of talked a little bit about before, but the way that games are sort of like a mirror that we hold up to ourselves to see how we're going to behave in a situation that we're not typically involved in. So this is like true of love, whereas I was saying, I've learned that I am submissive to the game, but in other games, you learn more about yourself. Like for example, Spec Ops: The Line, like Valentina was talking about, there's a scene where you are like, you use white phosphorus on what you don't know to be civilians, and then you discover they're civilians, and you have to like live with the knowledge that you did that. And it's so different from reading a book about that or watching a movie about that. Like you have done it. Going to sort of my research area in psychology, I work a lot with trying to generate emotional experiences in people to record it for psychological purposes. But one of the ways that I think is like the best way to do that is to get people to play video games where they have to make like moral choices or do things that affect them emotionally, because it's one thing to like see an ad where my research is in guilt. So it's one thing to see an ad where you're like being told, oh, you should be donating money, and you go, yeah, I should be donating money. And it's another thing to make a choice to shoot white phosphorus at a group of civilians and have to sit with that. It feels different, and that's what I think is really interesting about video games. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Can I say one more thing? One of the things that I really like running throughout all the papers is that emphasis on choice. And then when we were talking about trying to beat the game and how hard it is, I think there's something really interesting there, like a lesson that we can, I'm really thinking about Val's paper too with the political context about choice and the narratives around choice and just really what is possible. So, you know, that concept of a liberal individual that we've inherited from the 19th century. Well, what were the material conditions that makes this kind of narrative possible, you know? And when we're playing a game and we are making choices, and some choices work out and some don't, and we try other choices, we start thinking about that. Like, well, what else would be possible in this situation, or should be possible, or even, you know, we wind up doing a kind of critical analysis that we don't even realize is literature. It's literary history that we're doing.
Did any of you want to sort of say anything to that before?
Actually, I kind of relate.
Yeah.
So I was, sorry about this, I'll try to get it out in a way that makes sense. I was thinking about the panopticon, about control, which I think is a thing that goes through all of these games. And thinking about my work, which focuses a lot on fascism, authoritarianism, etc. And I was thinking about in Women in Love, novel by D.H. Lawrence, one of the characters who is a coal baron. He has this fascist fantasy of all of his workers becoming dehumanized, totally subservient to him, and he refers to it as integrating them into the quote unquote great and wonderful machine. And are we integrated into the great and wonderful machine in playing video games? Like the fact that video games do not allow us the full expression of our desires, of our morality, that it is always within the context that the game wants it to be. You know, does that do something to us? Are we also being integrated into that system and perhaps even, you know, in the worst case scenario, trained to be more responsive to laws, to systems in place that direct our behaviors?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think that it might depend on a couple of factors. So in the example of Black Ops, I would say that that game is political propaganda and has shown that there is players that play it can have a bit of a reduced empathetic view and are actually in it trained in combat so that they could then potentially join the American Armed Forces. So in that sense, absolutely, that game is created to make the player part of that system. But at the same time, I think that games, by giving us the illusion of choice and the ability to explore across those kind of different moral perceptions, also allow for the player to then reflect on those decisions and decide whether or not they want to be part of that idea. Going back to Undertale, when I first played Undertale, I did not know that you were not supposed to kill the monsters in it. So when I first went in, I did what I knew I was supposed to do as a video game player and just killed those. Through that, I then realized, oh no, I'm doing this incorrectly. And then I had to play the game. I completed that run and then started a new run, and I did that one totally peacefully. And then I started also doing the genocide run because I'm a completionist, and so I was like, oh, gotta do all of them. And I couldn't do it. Partially because I'm not very good at video games, and also because I couldn't ethically move forward with it. Even though there are these fictionalized characters, I had created like a connection to Sans Undertale, and I couldn't kill him. Also, that fight is really hard, and I couldn't do it. But I like to think that it was a moral decision. In Frostpunk, when I first played it, did it as ethically as I possibly could, and I actually had to sit and look at the different laws that I wanted to put in, and be like, is this the right decision? There were a couple of times in my original playthrough that I ended up having to be a little bit less moral than I would like to be. For example, I did end up having to pass a law that allowed for religious punishment of public whippings in my settlement, but I never did any of them. And I was like, see, it's okay. I passed the law, so it's allowed, but I'm not doing it. But I also, while prepping my presentation, had to do a speed run of the most horrible person ever in order to get the scene of my avatar being banished. And I'm still upset about the fact that I forced children to go and work in the literal coal mines, which caused them to die in game. And so I feel like in that, while it kind of forced me to try and put in this kind of the simulation of being part of the machine, in doing that, it also forced me to reflect on my position within the machine as a whole and want to make the decision to leave it.
So, all right, I got a couple of thoughts. So one thing that I'm thinking, for example, is that, so sometimes you need catharsis. So, and you do need a certain, like, an outlet, you know? And so if I love the movie 300, for example, okay? I love that movie 300. I am well aware that he would call me a slur. I am well aware of that. However, every time that he just kicks that guy in the hole, oh my God, you know, like, oh my God, high cinema, we never got to that point ever again. And I like to think that I am morally, I am very morally against, throwing weak children off a cliff. And 300 would never convince me of that. But what it does do is give me a couple of hours where there's just like this grime and shiny violence, and it can just get out of me, and it's there, and I'm having fun. And I feel like video games can give you that thing. Sometimes you just want to shoot people. Sometimes you want to go around on a real tournament and almost fall off a ledge and kill people, and that's okay. So, yeah, and okay, and the second point I wanted to make was about structures, and like video games do in a way control us, but I would argue that maybe unrestricted, like a complete freedom is not always the best, you know? Like people out there will listen to their music on the phone without wearing a headphone. And yes, it's a free country. No, we shouldn't have a law that says that we have to shoot them at dawn. But at the same time, they have to be taught that we live in a society,
We are kicking kids when we need them.
Exactly. So it's like there's just a lot of times where we think we want freedom. Freedom, let's say. But I think that what we actually want is healthy boundaries. So it's okay. So it's something that I think I see a lot with video games, where people are like, oh my God, I love open world games. Why aren't I allowed to like do everything I want? And then you get an open world game and it feels empty. And you're just there and you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. And for me, I cannot enjoy Skyrim. I try and I'm just like, I don't know who these people are and I don't care. And if I wanted to be out in the cold, I'd just be out in the cold, I don't know what I'm doing this. What I need is structure. What I need is a story that I like and being able to do actions that I like. So it's not just, it's okay to have rules that you have to follow. It's okay to have a system. It's just like you need to make sure that the system is for you. I think that's it. And then we can learn.
I just want to ask if you ever tried shooting the Jarls in Paris. I'm just saying, I think it could be really cool.
The great answer, just one more thought just about the panopticon, is that even when we feel that we are expressing ourselves where it's some sort of a positive outlet, or we're actually able to take actions that align with our moral systems, there's still, especially now with video games, given the systems and their connectivity to the internet, we are being surveilled. Every time you do something in the game, a lot of them you get an achievement, and that becomes part of the statistic that the game can use to make future decisions. So, there is this complicated element. Even when it feels morally correct, we're actually participating in a kind of capitalist, cold system that, perhaps isn't the fantasy of kind of, artistic, freedom that we imagine.
I mean, absolutely. Like, think of in-game, what are they called? Like, it's basically gambling, where you're, what? Loot boxes, yeah. And that is actually obviously bad for people. And I think it just comes back to that thing of like, it's okay to have constrictions, but you have to realize what constrictions you should have, you know, just because you can gamble online or like call yourself a slur on you know, Xbox Live. Do you want to do it? You know, you maybe not, you know? And I don't know, at one point it's like, yeah, it's like everybody has to just learn to be better.
Okay, I mean, I feel like we had a hand in this general direction like decades ago.
Yeah, we moved on.
Let's go, yeah, over to the.
Thank you very much for your presentations. This is a question for Chloe. I was wondering that the limited agency and the illusion of freedom that we have in video games, does it reflect the same level of limitations we have in real life about freedom and exertion of free will? Because in real world, we are also bound by rules. We are bound by the structures created for us, the structures of success, structures of failure. And I'm wondering, like, is that the same thing, but like on a smaller scale, or is it different?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, it's a great question. It's really interesting to think about. I think that it's definitely true. Like, I think, right, like when you really like dive into the meta of it all, there's definitely like, I mean, like we're all bound by the laws of physics, for example, right? Like we are definitely all constrained all the time. I think like in a lot of ways, video games, and I think we've kind of been like brushing over this a lot, are kind of like, video games are kind of constructing our worlds and our societies like in miniature in lots of different ways. And everybody's interested in like, you know, something specific. So like a specific game gets made that addresses that like aspect, like for example, the Panopticon, or it addresses something like, you know, specific, like how much fun it would be to run a little farm, or it addresses something specific, like, you know, your relationship to a game. But I think that like, I think basically it's like video games are in so many ways a reflection of our reaction to the world and our reflection of the way that we exist within the world. So I think it's like, yes, basically they are in a lot of ways the world, the real world, kind of in miniature. Each one acting out like the specific elements and aspects and features that the creator finds particularly valuable or interesting to reflect upon. If that addresses the question.
Thank you.
Thoughts, questions, comments?
Two very brief informational comments, and that's first of all about the Frostpunk game. I've done a little bit of research on this war of mine, which is also 11-bit studios. They're very open to communicating. So if you're ever wanting to reach out to them, I would highly suggest doing it. The other thing I actually wanted to mention, and I might be misremembering, but I think the central block of Kingston Pen is organized like a panopticon.
Yeah, they have a plaque and they talk about it as being a model prison. It
Yeah.
was one of the panopticon models in the 19th century.
So it's definitely worth going if you can see it.
All right, well, join me in thanking all of our speakers again today. Coming and listening to our very first game talk, Let's Play. We will definitely be doing more of these. Thank you for attending on Zoom. If you have any interest in participating, come give us a chat. We'd love to have more folks get involved. But thank you again. Congratulations.